Did somebody break your heart? Looking like an angel, but you're savage, love. When you kiss me, I know you don't get to, but I still want that. Your savage love. Your savage love.
All right, welcome back, folks. So in our first video for this first meeting of our class, I talked to you about how we're going to learn. We're going to use these videos, but I'm going to put an emphasis on what I call learning by doing, which we'll be doing over Zoom together. And the doing, the skills that we're going to learn, textual analysis and applied analysis, which I explained briefly to you then. But what are we going to learn? Well, easy. Multiculturalism. Obvious. The problem, though, is that there are many different competing visions of multiculturalism, and we're going to have to pick between them. You have to pick over the course of the term which one of these you're going to endorse as you see it applied to issues. There may be a theory that you like, but then when you see it applied to an issue, it reaches a conclusion you don't like, and you're going to have to rethink the theory because of that. And these theories differ really on two questions. What is a culture? And what does it mean for a multitude of them to coexist? So basically, to start this course, we're going to have to define the keywords in the title of the very course itself. What's culture and what is multi, so to speak? So in this vid, we're going to cover what is culture. Now, that may seem obvious. I know culture when I see it, you might say, but we're going to spend some time on different definitions of it. And over the course of time, hopefully what you'll see is it's not at all easy to define that term. Now, there are things that all of the definitions of culture can agree upon. One, culture is not racial or genetic. But two, cultures might seem to us to have the same dividing lines as genetic groups because culture is a product of human groups, and sometimes the human groups that form out there are genetically linked. And a third thing they all agree on, individuals acquire at least some, if not all, of their characteristics from their culture. So there's three basic agreements there, and all the definitions agree that the things being studied when we study culture boil down to two categories, practices and norms. So practices, those are things like spoken languages, religious rituals, arts, clothing, food, beauty and cleanliness habits. Those are all practices. Norms, okay, those are things like customs, etiquette, morality, beauty standards, not habits, but standards, and attitudes as well, attitudes towards family, sex, gender, property. And also we're going to see one element of culture might itself be the ideas that we have about the separateness of the self from the culture. At any rate, all of those things are norms. Okay, but I'm going to tell you the truth. Those are the only things on which all of these definitions of culture agree. They don't agree on how these practices and norms cohere together. The older view was that the norms might simply be kind of like the dough that holds the cookie together, while the practices are the chocolate chips that go into that dough. They are the things that give a culture its unique flavor, what makes it a chocolate chip cookie, in other words, rather than just a generic cookie. And a lot of you, when you think about culture, you probably think of the chocolate chips, so to speak. And we'll see from our TikTok clips later in this video that most TikTokers, at least, still think only about practices when they're asked about culture. And in particular, they seem to focus on practices of dance, food, and clothing, and so forth. But the newer view is that the norms are what really hold together the practices, that the metaphorical dough has to complement the chips quite nicely, and it's integral to them even performing their role as flavors, right? So dough and chips co-create each other in a certain sense. Apart, they're nothing, but together, they're a chocolate chip cookie. And if you do any baking, you know you can't just use the dough from another type of cookie, add chocolate chips to it, and voila presto, chocolate chip cookies, norms and practices have to fit in a certain sense, like the chocolate chip cookie goes with the proper chocolate chip cookie dough. But then we'll see from our TikTok clips that some users think more broadly about culture as including things like social norms, class, race, social institutions like schools and etc., and even sort of elements of personality, the personality through which we relate to each other, and things like that. So for instance, race may not itself be culture. As I said, the definitions agree, but perhaps it's one of a number of social norms that make a culture hang together in some sense. Your personality, likewise, is not culture, but a blend of different personality types make a culture what it is, perhaps. And we'll see Thursday that some thinkers begin to say that these norms are the structure that make the elements of a culture cohere, that make them come together, and that make them have meaning in relation to each other. And these people, not surprisingly, call themselves the structuralists. Then another thing that anyone defining culture has to account for is that cultures are both wholes and made up of parts. So we sometimes talk about cultures as if they were self-contained and integrated. There is, in our language, Mixtec culture, Thai culture, Black American culture, gay culture, although some people we'll see are going to deny that either of those latter two examples are culture. So is there a single thing that makes up a culture? You either have it or you don't. You're either a member of it or you aren't. Or is it instead that there are actually disparate features that we just simply group together under one of the general headings of the type I just used? So people in this explanation could be more or less Thai, for instance, depending upon which parts of the culture they exhibit. And then another question, if cultures are wholes, are cultures autonomous entities? Or do they live in the people who make them up, inseparable from those people? If they're autonomous, then they exist apart from the people who make them up, and they influence those people from the outside, as it were. One anthropologist used the analogy of a coral reef. Just as a reef is constructed by creatures, but exists independently of those creatures and outlasts those creatures, so culture, although it's a human product, has an independent existence. But others disagree, of course. They suggest that a culture does not and cannot exert a force in itself. Instead, it is simply the collection of what the members of that culture think and believe at any given moment. Culture for them is not an organic entity. They call this the organic fallacy. It is inseparable from the group, and it lives all at once in all of the different entities, people, who make it up. So there's two dichotomies that people have disagreed about when defining culture: whole or parts, autonomous or inseparable. It's really hard to know. If someone in American culture, whatever that is, refuses to watch baseball or refuses to love freedom, we'd still say they're American, right? And if they can be part of a culture without endorsing its norms or engaging in its practices, then how is the culture whole? Or how does it exert autonomous influence? We might deeply believe that culture does exert influence on people, and yet not come away from our studies thinking that it acts from the outside or that it makes up a whole. Okay, so with those distinctions in mind, let me actually tell you about a few cultural theorists you didn't read, because they're going to form the backdrop to Claude Lévi-Strauss, the first culture theorist who you will read for Thursday. So the first of these folks I'm going to tell you about is Edward Tyler, one of the first anthropologists. And his was really the first definition of culture from all the way back in the mid-19th century. But notice, when I tell you about it, he mixes practices and norms and all kinds of things together in his definition. So he says that culture is that complex whole which includes belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by humans as members of society. So let me repeat that to you again. So he says that culture is that complex whole which includes belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by humans as members of society. Tyler certainly thought cultures were distinct, but he thought you could compare certain features of cultures across time and space. And when you compared them, he thought, you'd see similarities in all cultures. Enough similarities that you could actually place them all on a scale from the least developed to the most developed. He said they all pass through the same stages, so different cultures can basically be ranked on how many of these stages that they've passed through. In his time, he said, that would place Italy above China, above Australia, at least for him. But other anthropologists rebelled against this sort of ranking of cultures. They agreed that Tyler was onto something important and new, this insight of his that there must be these things called cultures out there, more than just the customs or the traditions or the national characteristics that people had been talking about for decades or centuries. But although folks accepted that there must be these things called cultures, they rejected ranking them. So Franz Boas became famous for this, and his theory swept anthropology in the late 19th century. And when he brought it to America, to Columbia University in the 1890s, he essentially founded American anthropology. So Boas was a historical particularist. He thought cultures respond to their own particular historical events and not that they follow some sort of progression through stages. Indeed, he went so far in this belief that some people say he was also the founder of American relativism, which is a topic we'll take up again in week 3. Boas and his followers saw each culture as radically distinct. You could not say, for them, that a culture is at an earlier stage in evolution, but only that it's different. One of his followers, Margaret Mead, studied, for instance, how child rearing is the means by which culture is installed into an individual. So she wrote a book called Coming of Age in Samoa and made a shocking argument for its time. It was 1928. She said that Samoans, aged 14 to 18, weren't stressed out teenagers worried about sex and popularity or whatever. She said they were chill, engaging in casual sex, not worried about fitting into the social group. Or, in other words, she was arguing that the American idea of adolescence or of teenage angst was just an artifact of the hang-ups that American kids were taught to have by their child rearing. They were taught to have hang-ups about sex and about social life and so on. Now, Mead reserved judgment about this. Samoans, she said, were neither better or worse. Our practices and their practices just come from norms and child rearing, she said. Although, to be honest, later scholars found that she might have been wrong about Samoan sex norms and etc., because her informants might have been telling her tall tales, as it were. We can actually talk about that in class at some point if you want, and talk about the process of doing analysis in anthropology. But at around the same time as Mead, there were other anthropologists who were returning to something like Tyler's view. They also didn't want to do Tyler's ranking, but like Bronislaw Malinowski, they actually argued that the key to understanding a society was to see how its features served certain needs that are basic to all of humanity and common to humanity as a whole. Each culture could, of course, meet those needs in distinctive ways, and furthermore, they could actually create unique, culturally based needs. But in general, all cultures were responding to universal, shared human needs, so they could all be compared in some sense because they all had similar bases. Now, this is not relativism, the idea that different norms really are good for different people. Again, we'll talk about that in week 3, but this came to be called functionalism, the idea that cultural norms and practices always serve a function in upholding the human-centered goals of society, and that they can all be understood to the extent that they serve that function. Even if the members of the culture understand themselves to be doing what's right or true or whatever it might be, They're really just doing things that have the function of upholding the society itself. Okay, so we can see that there are tons of questions about culture. Are they based on practices or are they based on norms? How do they relate to other social structures? Are they organic wholes or made up of parts? Are they autonomous entities or inseparable from the people who make them up? Lots of disputes about this. Let's turn to the videotape. Let's see what TikTokers think. Their confusion about what a culture is and what makes them a part of a given culture may actually stem from all these academic disagreements. Let's see. All right, so this is how people responded to the TikTok #culture challenge. Not surprisingly, they actually started where anthropological theory had started 150 years ago, with cultural practices like dance, music, food, clothing. Dance was a really common element that people identified with their culture. This guy here looks like he's maybe a member of the New Zealand rugby team, the All Blacks. He's doing the haka, a traditional Maori dance. And we're actually going to look at the Maori in topic 9 on feminism and culture. People also referred to food a lot. I mean, a lot. And food is related to culture, especially when you think about how it's combined with other cultural practices. So here this Lebanese woman talks about getting a coffee and listening to a famous Lebanese singer, Fayrouz. Food and music coming together. But food is more than food. For this woman, food becomes not a practice, but a symbol. Mayonnaise symbolizes her white European heritage, and soy sauce symbolizes her Japanese heritage. And maybe the most common cultural practice to come up in these videos was dress or clothing. These two seem to be representing their two cultural heritages with two separate styles of dress. And perhaps since TikTok is a visual medium, clothes were displayed really often as elements of culture. You might have come away thinking from these videos that clothes were in fact gendered as well, since it seemed most common for women to want to represent their culture with outfits. In fact, it was so common that this woman didn't see this as a #culture challenge at all. She just thought everybody was showing off their Indian clothes. Some people identified their culture with their genetic heritage. If my parents were this, then I am too. But when you combine this with other elements of cultural practice, it caused some anxiety for some TikTokers. This woman seems to be rebelling against the trend a little bit. So maybe you're going to expect her to pop into the clothes of her parents' culture or her genetic heritage. But she seems to want to say that she identifies with a clothing style and an activity, yoga. This woman seems to rebel as well. She'd rather be in the peanut butter and jelly costume because being in cultural clothing causes people to identify her with her genetic heritage. And as she says in the caption, she's fetishized, called exotic, thought of as foreign, and insulted. This fella has some anxiety around clothes too. If he doesn't wear the clothes of his parents' culture, does that mean he's become too white? In a multicultural country, do we identify our separateness through our clothing? A lot of people actually talked about their country of origin or birth as being part of their culture. This makes nationality a part of culture. And here this woman suggests that the place of her parents' birth is as much a part of her culture as the place of hers. But this woman seems to identify less with where she was born or where her father was from than she does with her current country of residence. As she says, Australia has multiculture as a culture. It's a multicultural nation. Immigration status played a role in a lot of these videos. This young woman talks about where her parents immigrated from, but then by donning clothes, she says she'll never forget where we come from. Her parents' nation of origin and therefore her culture are both seen as physical origin points. And I love this guy. He talks about his immigration status, his nation of origin, and the smaller ethnic group he was a part of in that country. And notice his name is Cross-Culture Christian. He was born for this challenge. You'll see this woman too talks about her country of birth and her country of citizenship, so her nationality is a complicated matter. And you'll see she refers also to the smaller ethnic group that she's a part of. Lots of people mentioned their religions as part of their culture, and we're in fact going to take a look at an issue involving the Amish and Mennonites when we study religion. Still others took the word culture to mean society, it seems. This woman talks about her social class, really. She's an elite college grad trying to make it in New York City, as a lot of you will be too, and this gives her certain practices and habits and so on. So, is that a culture? This woman talks about the traumas she experienced in school and work, social institutions, and she talks about what these made her into, her personality, we might call it. Culture? And this woman just wants to talk about her personality, her social identity, who she says she really is. And of course, in America, we think of race, another social institution. This is an NFL football player saying he identifies with his race and with a nation of origin. And here, Lauren Gray identifies whiteness as culture. But in doing it, she identifies it with being basic, vanilla. If at the beginning we saw culture with spicy food and colorful dress, here we see whiteness as blandness and sweatpants. Indeed, this idea of whiteness as absence is so widespread that this person identifies whiteness as a blank wall, nothingness. Where did this idea come from? Okay, so if that was a little anthropological field study of TikTok, what we found out from our study is that a lot of different people are proposing a lot of different things as elements of culture. And we're going to see over time that there are a lot of different theories about how those elements can stick together, how the dough and the chocolate chips come together. Some people will actually reject the idea that some of those things proposed by TikTokers ought even to be called culture. Others will say, we have theories that can show you how all of those things cohere together through culture itself. But the first thing we want to do when we get together in class is talk about your ideas of what constitutes a culture. Who'd you agree with there? Which TikToker had it right? Or do all of them have it right? I look forward to discussing that question with you when we meet together synchronously. See you then.